That's not fair. It is the easiest complaint in the world to make. Even the smallest child has a very well developed sense of what they think is and isn't fair. Sometimes the cry of "that's not fair" has no kind of basis in reality whatsoever. Sometimes it does. Very often though, when we cry "that's not fair," what we really mean is, that's not fair for me. I'm not too worried about anyone else. That's not fair to me. Because when we grumble and when we complain, we generally think that someone somewhere else is getting a better deal than us. And that's not fair, we say. The cry of "that's not fair" though, actually is an important one. Not in the way that we use it for our own gain, but in looking at what kind of world we live in and in what kind of world we want to live in, what kind of community we're building. Because here we are, we're looking at Nehemiah, which is essentially a book about a building project, at least the first half of it is. It's all about building walls, the broken down walls of Jerusalem. But this building project has spiritual significance. Rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem re-establishes the city of God, and it reflects God's glory and God's power and God's priorities to the world around. And like with rebuilding the temple that we thought about in the run-up to Christmas, building the walls is all about establishing a community, establishing God's people, creating a community of people who live under his ways and according to his priorities. And as we're going to see today, one of those priorities is to build a community of justice. Now, that's not easy, particularly in testing times. Remember, last week we saw how there was some serious opposition to rebuilding the walls, to what God's people were doing. And everyone in the community had to step up to the project. They had to kind of leave what they were doing and step up to the task of building. Everyone made sacrifices. But the thing is, the sacrifices that were needed to keep things going affected different people in different ways. So because they were working on the walls, some people couldn't work. Some people couldn't pay their mortgages and couldn't pay their taxes. Some people were struggling for food, all because they had committed themselves to this work and to this project. The nation was going through a time of sacrifice to get the walls built, but it was affecting different people in different ways. And I was thinking about us today, here in the UK under COVID restrictions. And I remember a while ago, I'm not sure if it was a politician or who it was I heard say this, but I heard someone say, in our current COVID crisis, we're all in the same boat. Actually, that isn't true. We're all in the same storm, for sure. But we are not all in the same boat. And if you've got a big old yacht, you're probably going to do a lot better than someone in a rowing boat. And that's where the cry of "that's not fair" is worth listening to. God is someone who hears the cries of his people, especially those who are poor and oppressed, and he responds. He calls his people to do the same thing as well. Back in Isaiah, God's people are saying to God, "Look at what we do for you. We fast, we pray, we worship, we're honouring you. What are you doing, God?" And the prophet tells the people to take a look at themselves. Take a look at how you're living. Not what you're doing, but how you're living. It's not about being seen to do the religious thing. It's about living a life under God's priorities. And then the prophet says, if you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk. And if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday. Life becomes lighter and brighter when we live according to God's priorities, standing up for the poor, meeting the needs of the oppressed, and so on. And in doing that, the prophet says, you build something way more than walls. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. You'll build a city that's worth living in. Secure, good foundations where people can live in peace. Nehemiah had to work through some of this because there was a cry of "that's not fair" from his own people. The complaints of the people were a threat to the ongoing work of building the walls. It was a threat to something that was building to honour God. But as we'll see, Nehemiah assessed the situation, and when he did that, he found that their complaints were justified. Something needed to be done. Because the people of God were not acting in ways which honoured God through their dealings with one another. It was no good building a wall around God's city if the community it protected didn't reflect the heart of God. And likewise, it's no good us building up a church community if our lives don't reflect God's heart and God's priorities. Today, I'm really delighted that Graeme McMeekin, who is the head of Tearfund in Scotland, has recorded our message for us. He's going to help us think really practically about the challenges of living with God's priorities in today's world. It was a challenge for Nehemiah and his people, and it's a challenge for us too.
Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." Still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have had to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind, and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, "You are charging your own people interest." So I called together a large meeting to deal with it, and said, "As far as possible, we have brought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people, only for them to be sold back to us." They kept quiet, because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, "What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain, but let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you are charging them. 1% of money, grain, new wine, and olive oil." "We will give it back," they said, "and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say." Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised.
Good morning, Glasgow Chinese Church. It's great to be with you this morning and to join with you. My name's Graeme McMeekin. I work for a Christian international development organisation called Tearfund, and it's great to be with you today. Today in our passage we've been looking at Nehemiah 5. Now if you remember the story of Nehemiah, Nehemiah had seen the plight of his people in Jerusalem. He had seen that the walls were all torn down. And then he went and he pleaded to get funds to go and rebuild that wall. And he came and he urged the people to join together to rebuild. He inspected the walls, he prayed over it, inspected them, and got them all to work on different bits of the project and build walls here, there, and everywhere along the lines until they were building up those walls. However, as we read the story of Nehemiah, we realise that there are still problems there. What he realised was that there was poverty taking place within his own people, caused by his own people. People were suffering from oppression through increased mortgages and taxes. They were being charged interest, and they were just struggling to feed themselves and to pay for what they needed because of the impositions put on them by their own people. And so there was real strife and real turmoil taking place. And that's where we pick up the story in Nehemiah chapter 5. See, what was going on was Nehemiah had seen, as he'd heard the stories of the people and everything else, that there were broken relationships taking place. There was a breakdown in the relationship between the most poor in the society and the richer in the society. And this was of great concern to him, mainly because he could see that people were struggling just to stay alive, to feed their children, to keep on going day by day. Within those that study the Bible and everything else will be aware of the concept of shalom. Shalom is the Hebrew word for peace. But it's more than just a peace, as in not in a time of war. It's a deep-seated peace. It's about being at peace. At peace with God, at peace with your neighbour, at peace with the environment all around us, and at peace with ourselves. Shalom is that deep-seated peace. And whenever we have broken relationships, a lot of that peace is broken. We feel bad about ourselves, we feel bad about our neighbour, things get destroyed all around about us, and actually we start yelling at God and being annoyed at God about why this is happening. That need for shalom type peace. Nehemiah could see that as he was looking around, that this broken relationship meant that actually people were not at peace. There was a real great concern about the need for peace. As we pick up the story and read through it, we see that this relationship was internal. It was primarily between the people themselves. As I say, it's because of interest rates and mortgages and things that were keeping people in poverty. The same happens today as well. We have people who are in poverty all around the world, concerned by all sorts of things. And a lot of it is actually a poverty that's caused by others in the world. If I take one of the most common examples at the minute of climate change. Recent studies in 2019 looked at the history of the world and looked at the human activity and the damage it was causing. And it said that 75% of terrestrial environments and 66% of marine environments have been severely altered by our human activity. And it's one thing for us to say, okay, well that's land and that's sea and that's just the things around us. But that profoundly affects people. And it's the people in the poorest parts of the world that are most deeply affected by these things. We at Tearfund have been working with a climate change scientist called Catherine Hayhoe and been working with her to understand a little bit more about what's going on and the effects that our lives have and how that affects people overseas. Because climate change is being caused primarily by the richest countries in the world and the richest people in the world. And that includes us in the UK. It has a huge effect. In fact, the gap between the richest and the poorest has increased by about 25% as a result. For us in our society, we don't think twice about putting the heating on or driving in a car somewhere, as long as we're allowed to within the regulations. But that has a huge impact for those overseas. I'll let Catherine Hayhoe tell you in her own words some of what that means and what that looks like.
The reason why we care about a changing climate is not because a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 degree increase in the average temperature of the entire planet really matters that much to any one of us. It's because that temperature increase, like the first domino in a row of dominoes, kicks off a series of interconnected impacts and events that affect all of us around the world, but affect the poorest and most vulnerable more than any. The single best description I've heard of climate change was coined by the US military, if you can believe it, and it's this: climate change is a threat multiplier. In other words, it takes all of the other issues that we already care about, all of the issues, for example, that are exemplified by the Sustainable Development Goals, issues of poverty, hunger, lack of education, basic healthcare resources. It takes these issues and it makes them worse. Another way to think about it is with this image of a bucket with a hole in it. We're pouring all of our efforts into this bucket to alleviate poverty, hunger, disease, lack of access to clean water, refugee crises, and more. Yet that bucket has a hole, and the hole is getting bigger and bigger over time, and there is no way to fill the bucket if we do not patch the hole. The hole is climate change. I care about climate change specifically because it does affect the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. It's no accident that there is a direct correlation between people who are already living in poverty and people who are most vulnerable. Because how climate change affects us is by loading the weather dice against us. In the places where we live, we know that we've always had heavy rainfall, floods, heat waves, hurricanes, droughts, storms, wildfire, and more. These are a normal and natural part of life on this planet. But the warmer it gets, the more frequent or the stronger and more damaging these events are getting. We know that the frequency of heavy precipitation is increasing. We know that heat waves are getting more extreme. We know that droughts are getting stronger. We know that wildfires are burning greater area. We know that cyclones, hurricanes, or typhoons, all the same storm, they're just called different names in different parts of the world. We know that they're not getting more frequent, but they're getting much bigger, stronger, slower, more powerful, with a lot more rainfall associated with them. And then there's the long-term changes, like creeping sea level, with 2/3 of the world's biggest cities, many of those in developing countries, lying within just a meter of sea level. So why does climate change matter? It matters precisely because it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. If we have a flood in a rich country, it can be devastating. It can produce very expensive damages. But if they have a flood in a developing country, as occurred, for example, 2.5 years ago in Bangladesh during the monsoon season, where due to the abnormally heavy rains, 1/3 of the entire country was underwater, the impacts can be beyond belief. Where I live, in Texas, we experienced a massive record-breaking drought in 2011 and 2012. Where we live is, climatologically speaking, very similar to Syria. And in Syria, they also experienced a drought that's estimated to be 2 to 3 times more likely as a result of a changing climate. But that drought was occurring on top of an unstable political system, on top of poverty, on top of ongoing conflict, a pre-existing internal refugee crisis, all of which led climate change and its impact on the drought to be like the final straw on the camel's back. You can have a healthy camel that doesn't have much on it, it can absorb that extra straw. But if you have a camel that is malnourished, underfed, in poor health, already overloaded, that's when climate change can truly be the final straw that breaks the camel's back. All across the world, since the 1960s, it's estimated that the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries has already increased by 25% due to the impacts of a changing climate. And this past year, the United Nations warned that climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of development, global health, and poverty reduction. We care about climate change because it is a threat multiplier. Climate change is not only an environmental issue, climate change is a poverty issue, it's a hunger issue. It's an issue of inequality and injustice. Climate change is a human issue, and that's why we care.
This time last year, a group from Tearfund Scotland went to Ethiopia to see for themselves some of the impact that this was making. And they went and met a lady called Orbisa. Orbisa lives in Afar, which is the northeast area of Ethiopia. And they met her in this really rural and arid environment. And as they did so, they were chatting to her and they realised that there was a big problem for her having access to water. There was a river that ran about 5 minutes away from where she lived, that actually during rainy season she could go and collect the water. However, the rainy seasons were getting less and less, so that actually rain was only coming about 1 month a year. The rest of the time she was having to walk 10 hours to go and get water. About 5 hours there, 5 hours back, leaving at 4 a.m. in the morning. Walking, being sort of trying to avoid jackals and other wild animals in the area that could really harm her and those that are with her, and to try and collect this water and try and bring back enough water for her and her family. It was quite a feat to think of that. And that is just a normal everyday occurrence for her about what she has to do because of the lack of water. And the lack of water is because of climate change and that impact. But the issues aren't just around climate change. Climate change we're focusing on particularly this year here at Tearfund because the UN are meeting in Glasgow in November to talk about climate change, and you'll know that Joe Biden has recently signed up to the Paris Agreement, which they'll be reviewing here in Glasgow in November. But there's also other things like, what do we do with our rubbish and our waste? What's happening with that? Well, a lot of it has in the past been sent overseas, ends up in people's back gardens, in places like Pakistan, where there's a family there who we were talking about in Tearfund a year or two ago, where the rubbish is burning in her backyard, the rubbish that's coming from Western states, and it's actually causing her children to have to go into hospital to be looked after because of the damage it's doing. More recently, we've got a big concern about what we're doing in the future. What's happening around vaccines? We hear about nations like the UK buying millions of doses. But actually, what's happening with places around Africa and Asia and other areas where actually they might not have the same access, they might not be able to afford it? Are we going to be able to give them the resources that they need in order to get the vaccines to prevent from coronavirus? There are real injustices in the world. There's questions, though, about what we do about it. Whenever we look at Nehemiah 5, we see that he had spotted that there was problems. It says, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. Do we get angry? It's quite easy for us to hear stories about people lacking water and everything else, and let them just wash over us. Excuse the pun. But do we really get angry about the needs of other people? About people being desperate for food, for water, for basic essentials that nobody should be without? Quite often we just don't get angry enough. And it is okay to get angry about the right types of things. What did Nehemiah do about it? Well, he called them together. Called all the people who were rich and charging these taxes and everything else, called them together, and he called them out. He called them out. He said, this is what the issue is. This is what the needs are. In fact, he was following a path that was set out in Proverbs chapter 31, where it says in verses 8 and 9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. And that's what he was doing there. He had heard their cries and was standing up for their defence. He had in the past been trying to help them at the root source, or at the cause. He had seen the weakness of Jerusalem and was trying to assess how he could protect them by building this wall and getting them to build this wall. However, that wasn't really solving the root of their current problems. He had to dig deeper. In Tearfund, we talk about a story of somebody walking by a river. And if you can imagine the scene, you're walking down by a river, and as you're walking along the river, and you're walking maybe further upstream, and you see somebody in the water yelling and shouting and crying out for help. What is it you do? Well, the first thing most of us would do would actually be see if we can help them. Can we throw them a life ring to help them and pull them out? Or if they're near the side, maybe get down and hold them up and pull them out. Maybe even dive in after them to try and save them. That would be quite a typical response. However, imagine doing that and then continuing with your walk up the river, and you're seeing somebody else in the same kind of need, struggling to breathe and flapping about, needing rescued, and then you would do the same again, and then you walk further upstream, and then there's another one. Then you realise, wait, there's maybe a problem here. So another alternative would be to go to the local village and teach them how to swim, so that they're not needing rescued every time. Teach them how to swim, and so that they can save themselves from that. But then, if you continue to walk up and you're seeing people still in that need and still swimming whilst they're trying to swim to get outside, you realise that there's a bigger problem. Eventually you make it to the top of the river and you see that the bridge is broken. That's why people are falling in. That's why the disaster's happening. What do you do? The problem is actually at the bridge. Fix the bridge at the top. Fix the root cause of the problem. That's what we in Tearfund are trying to do in multiple levels. And so are lots of other organisations. We might try to help people in their time of need. We might try to provide water for those that need water. We might try to provide food for those that need food. Alternatively, we want to do the equivalent of helping them to learn to swim. We want to teach them how to get water for themselves, how to get food for themselves, how to plant the right crops in the right areas, and everything else. However, we want to go deeper again. We want to see what the root cause of the problem. Why are people ending up in the water in the first place? Well, for things like climate change, we know it's because of climate change. We need to reduce some of our emissions. We need to act now to try and reduce the impact that we're having on the environment. For things like our rubbish, we need to reduce our rubbish, reuse more often, try to recycle, do less virgin plastics, those new plastics that are created that eventually end up in the rubbish dumps taking 400, 500 years to decompose. We need to take action to try and sort out the root causes. And that's what Nehemiah is trying to do here. The root cause was the mortgages and taxes and everything else. And he was trying to deal with it and trying to sort it out. What does that mean for us? Well, as I say, we can reduce some of our use, do the climate change, but we can also campaign and lobby. We can write letters to MPs and MSPs, to politicians, about reducing climate change and about actually making changes to rules around our use of cars or vehicles or flights to try and reduce down the emissions. But we can also do things, for example, lobbying companies. We had a campaign last year or the year before about lobbying the big companies that are producing the plastics. You know, Nestle, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Unilever, 4 big companies that were producing huge amounts of plastics all around the world that was ending up in people's back gardens all around the world who didn't have the means to get rid of this rubbish, and it was literally burning and intoxicating families there. Lobby them about changing their practices and using other materials that don't destroy the environment in quite the same way. We can also make personal changes as well. You know, we could change how much plastic we use. You know, instead of using a shower gel, use a bar of soap. Things like that, just basic changes in our environment. Instead of lifting a new plastic bag, take a plastic bag with us to do our shopping, or take some other kind of bag with us to do our shopping and reuse. And the last bit of this story, Zacchaeus, was somebody who we read about in the New Testament who repaid back all the things that he had taken from others. And we see in that as being an example of what Nehemiah has done before that. Nehemiah has asked him to return back the things that were costing the impact that it was making. So he campaigns to the people and says, return back the interest that you've taken from them. In the same way that Jesus challenges Zacchaeus in Luke, in the story of Luke, to give back fourfold what he has taken from others. I used to work in victim offender mediation, and an important part of that mediation was about paying back. What can we give back? It's the same today. If we do somebody wrong, how are we paying back? How are we paying back for the damage that we're doing? What are we doing about it ourselves? Not just about preventing, but paying back. There's all sorts of things that are happening at governmental level that we're looking at. Things like, you know, a climate justice fund, for example, for those that are impacted by climate change, and about actually funding back the penalties that we've taken off them by, you know, our pollution and the damage it's done, and repaying to try and get the countries back on their feet, to try and re-establish them. But at a very personal level, how are we each paying back? How are we each doing something to restore back that shalom, that broken relationship that was there. I would encourage each of you to spend some time just looking at that story in Nehemiah chapter 5 again, reviewing it and thinking it through and what it might mean for you. Let's pray. Almighty God, we thank you for the story of Nehemiah. And just as there was oppression and injustice happening at that time in Nehemiah's life, Lord, we long for you to show us what injustices are happening in our lifetime and how we can do something about it. Lord, speak to us, move within us, challenge us, and help us to respond to you so that we may see your justice done in this world. Amen. Thank you.